From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Greeks will hold elections soon because their parliament failed to elect a new president. Some Greek citizens say they are not looking forward to the elections. Susanna Steiner is one of them. She says the vote should not be happening now. It is the worst time for the economy and for security, she says, and everyone is unhappy. Takis Volsis is a businessman who agrees with Susanna Steiner. He says the government should have been left to do its work. But he says now that early elections are set for January 25th, Greeks will have to decide whom to vote for. The new Democratic Party of Prime Minister Adonis Samaras controls what has been the ruling coalition in Greece. But the Syriza Party is more popular in opinion surveys. Syriza says that if it wins control of parliament, austerity will be history. For years, the government has cut spending in an effort to solve a major debt crisis. Alexis Tsipras is the leader of Syriza. He says the new election will be the beginning of the end for the current leadership. He says the government sank Greece into poverty and worsened unemployment. The Syriza Party says it wants to renegotiate two economic rescue plans worth nearly $300 billion. The financial aid came from the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. They made the aid dependent on Greece enacting strong measures aimed at ending its financial problems. Opponents, however, say the spending cuts and tax increases have harmed the country. Greece now has an unemployment rate of more than 25%. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Prisuti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. The Senate recently passed a measure meant to ease passage of trade legislation. The bill will affect approval of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which involves 12 nations around the Pacific Ocean. But a sharp disagreement over freshwater catfish has hurt the trade negotiations in the U.S. Senate. Farm-raised catfish is a local U.S. industry valued at less than $1 billion in yearly production. The Senate dispute arose when Republican lawmaker John McCain criticized a measure calling for increased U.S. government inspections of Asian catfish. He said the true purpose of the catfish program is to protect a small handful of catfish farmers in the South. McCain called the measure a protectionist program. 7 years ago, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was ordered to establish and administer a new catfish inspection plan. 10 Asian Pacific nations have sent letters warning that this issue is hurting TPP negotiations. At least one nation, Vietnam, has threatened trade retaliation. Senator Roger Wicker represents the state of Mississippi, one of America's biggest catfish producers. He says the real issue is not protectionism, but the health of American consumers. He says this is about food safety. Senator Wicker says Asian-produced seafood has been found to have higher levels of chemicals and other harmful substances. The strong debate is just one of the barriers to completing the 12-nation free trade agreement. Each country has its own interest to protect. For VOA Learning English, I'm Jonathan Evans.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. More people are able to receive higher education worldwide than in the past. But the amount of higher education is causing social and economic divisions in many countries. A recent study by the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, or OECD, also finds that some developing countries are making progress. 5 years ago, the world financial crisis hurt many nations, but it did not slow growth in education. The OECD report notes the quality and amount of education is increasing the division between what it calls the haves and the have-nots. In some areas, rising unemployment has affected people with lower education levels more than others. They earn considerably less than those with higher degrees. There are 34 economically developed countries in the OECD. Among those countries, the unemployment rate for people with a university education is about 5%. However, the rate is almost 20% for 25 to 34-year-olds who do not have a university degree. This situation also exists in developing economies. Andreas Schleicher is the Education and Skills Director for the OECD. He says education makes more of a difference in the life chances of people than in the past. The report finds that education makes a greater difference for individuals within countries. But it also notes that education is reducing divisions between developed and developing countries. Mr. Schleicher says countries like China, Vietnam, and Brazil are making education an important goal. He says they are investing their limited resources to get good teachers and school leaders. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. The Swiss-based World Economic Forum has released its latest Global Competitiveness Report. The report rated Switzerland as the world's most competitive country for the 7th year. Next on the list were Singapore and the United States. Others among the top 10 were Germany, Netherlands, Japan, Hong Kong, Finland, Sweden, and Britain. The report says countries need to accept reforms to improve productivity. They also need to support entrepreneurs, people who start new businesses. Most countries report economic growth, but growth is weaker than before the 2008 financial crisis. The report warns that some developing countries that fail to compete enough will not be able to deal with future economic shocks. Margareta Dreznik-Hanuz is with the World Economic Forum. She says digital technology in machinery and manufacturing is important worldwide, but it is the human factor that is critical to competitiveness, she says. That means education and flexibility of the labor market. The 2015-2016 report used 12 groupings to rate nations. These include roads and other infrastructure, health and primary education, business sophistication, and innovation. The report says the larger emerging markets are making little progress in competitiveness. The exceptions are India and South Africa. The report says China ranked 28th, but it says China's failure to move up in the rankings shows the country is facing some difficult economic issues. For VOA Learning English, I'm Ann Ball. From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, added China's yuan to its group of key global currencies recently. This is an historic development that gives new status to the world's second largest economy. China now accounts for more than 15% of the global gross economic output. The Wall Street Journal said that is nearly 3 times what it was 10 years ago. The IMF said the yuan, also called the renminbi, will be added to the group of reserve currencies. Those include the US dollar, Europe's euro, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. The IMF uses this group of reserve currencies to make emergency loans to its 188 member nations. The new IMF designation will take effect at the end of next September. China had worked toward winning the designation for several years. The New York Times said China gave up some of its tight control over its currency and reformed its financial sector in order to get the new status. The IMF decision reflects the declining influence of Europe in world financial markets. In the new IMF designation, the IMF will give more weight to China's currency than to either the yen or the pound. Despite the increased role for the yuan, the US dollar still dominates in finance and trade. The Wall Street Journal wrote, "The dollar is the world's preeminent reserve currency. It is still the most widely used currency for savings around the world. This is because investors feel confident that they can get access to money traded in dollars. For VOA Learning English, I'm Ann Ball.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. India's new government is developing a plan to increase economic growth, which has fallen to its lowest level in nearly 20 years. The government, led by the Bharatiya Janata Party of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is expected to be more friendly to business. And it has promised greater opportunities for foreign investors. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley recently presented the new government's first budget. The Indian economy has grown at only 5% for each of the last 2 years. Mr. Jaitley presented the yearly budget 6 weeks after the Bharatiya Janata Party came to power. The party is trying to find chances for the 1 million people who enter the workforce every year. Mr. Jaitley said the new budget would set the government on a path to higher economic growth. Indian and foreign investors closely examined the government's first budget. They questioned if Prime Minister Modi could raise business support in the country. He had been popular with the business community in Gujarat state, where he served as chief minister. The government announced several economic reforms to show that it plans to help business. One permits more private investment in the defense and insurance industries. That amount was increased from 26% to 49%. The government also promised a bigger part for private industry in the improvement of roads, railroads, airports, and other systems. It also announced measures to help manufacturing. The government said it will establish a simpler goods and services tax to make it easier to do business across the country's 29 states. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Chinese officials have predicted lower economic growth again this year. They say that huge government spending programs are coming to a close. Instead, officials say they are seeking what they call higher quality but more modest growth. The goal is to increase spending at home in China and grow the economy in a more balanced way. In March, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang reinforced this opinion when he announced a target growth rate of 7% for 2015. That is well below the average over the last 20 years. However, there are signs that the government has not yet ended its big spending programs. Li Keqiang announced a 13% increase in fixed asset investments, things like buildings and machinery. The premier also said there would be new spending in energy, railways, water management, and housing. In January, Mr. Lee promised to create 10 million new jobs in 2015, partly through investment in building projects. The new spending program is less than the stimulus plan China put in place during the world financial crisis. In 2008, China announced a spending package of $570 billion. This year, however, $260 billion is set aside for spending on the economy. To pay for new projects, the government is borrowing money. Finance Minister Lu Jiwei said in a news conference that deficit spending will be about 2.7% of the gross domestic product. The GDP is the value of all goods and services produced by the economy in 1 year. For VOA Learning English, I'm Jonathan Evans.